Locheil and his men of Clan Cameron set upon the English with brutal ferocity, with Locheil himself tearing the throat from an English officer, later stating it was the sweetest bite he had ever taken. This, and a number of attacks like this, happened during the construction of what would be known as the Black Garrison. So, welcome to Fort William, folks, and a very rare, beautiful day in Scotland. Now, as you can see, there's actually not much left of the physical buildings that used to stay inside this fort, because they're all gone. What's left is just the stone structure of the fort that was built in the late 17th century and was named Fort William. But it wasn't always called Fort William. If you go back to the middle of the 17th century and the War of the Three Kingdoms, the English Civil War, had just finished. Now, just to briefly touch on that, what that was it was a war in the three kingdoms of what you know as the British Isles at the time. It was Ireland, Scotland and England. Charles I, he was the king at the time. Now, to cut a long story short, he was a bit of a tyrant. He was part of the Stuart line of kings, and they kind of believed in this divine right as king. You could pretty much do what you want, and he really kind of pushed off Parliament when he wanted to do things like raise taxes and implement certain policies. He really just tried to bypass Parliament, and they didn't like that. So essentially, they rose up, the parliamentarians, led by it was many figures they were led by, but one of the main ones you probably have heard was Oliver Cromwell. So they formed the Commonwealth and actually started the first part of the English Civil War. Now, that ended in the defeat of Charles I, and that force was majority made up by strong supporters of him from Scotland and Ireland. So Charles I, he was defeated by Oliver Cromwell, and he was handed over by the Scots to the English, where he was sent to London and he had his head chopped off, as you do. So that ended the first part of the Civil War. Charles I was defeated. Cromwell and the parliamentarians, the Commonwealth with the new model army, they were now in control. And then came the second part of the war, where Charles II, the son of Charles I, he reignited the war with his claim to the throne, because essentially the parliamentarians and Cromwell, they wanted to abolish the monarchy. They wanted to get rid of, that system, because they wanted their own, they wanted to have a democracy in Parliament, and they wanted to totally get rid of the monarchy. They melted down the English crown jewels, and they tried to do the same with the Scottish crown jewels. But that's actually a quick little story on that. It's Scotland at the time when Cromwell invaded during Charles II's part of the war. Scotland hid the crown jewels at Dunnottar Castle, which is in the northeast of Scotland. Now Cromwell's army laid siege to that castle, and they hid the crown jewels at Dunnottar because it was deemed the safest place in Scotland at the time. So during the night, a woman named Christine Granger, she was the wife of the local priest from the local Kenneth parish church. She smuggled the jewels from the castle out to the church during the night under her clothes, and there they hid the crown jewels under the church, where it was unearthed 10 years later during King Charles II's restoration. So Charles II, long story short, he was defeated, he fled in exile. So now Cromwell and the parliamentarians, they had successfully conquered Ireland, Scotland, and they had control of the whole kingdom. So that was the end of the War of the Three Kingdoms. So on reflection of this, they obviously knew that the Highlands here was a strong supporter of the Stuarts, the Stuart dynasty. Now their dynasty had lasted hundreds of years in Scottish history. So they knew the Highlands was a strong area of support for the Stuarts. So they decided to build a series of forts throughout the Highlands. Now there was a couple, but they built the main one here. It wasn't called Fort William at the time. It was just known as Inverlochy, and this was like the centre of Lochaber, and Lochaber is the region. It was strategically placed because they knew this location here was very advantageous for keeping a garrison stored here and keeping control of the Highlands, because you could be supplied from the sea, from Glasgow and Edinburgh. Ships could come up the west coast, come up Locheil and supply this fort, because this fort, it's protected by 3 bodies of water. So you can see it's got a body of water on 1, 2, 3 sides, and then the other side is what you see here, the town of Fort William. So in June 1654, General George Monck of the Commonwealth Army, he ordered 1,000 men to come here and construct a garrison and a fort to essentially pacify the Highlands and the clans and the Highlanders in this area, now that the Royalists had been defeated, and they essentially wanted to come here and pacify them and assert their control, and this was a very strategic area for that. So it was a really advantageous position, and it was specifically built in this area in the region of Lochaber, because it was central to where all the main clans were. You had Clan Cameron and Achnacarry, you had the MacDonalds of Glengarry, Keppoch, MacDonalds of Keppoch, the MacLeans of Duart and the Isle of Mull, and also the MacDonalds of Glencoe. So they obviously chose this area for that reason. But when they built the fort at the time, it wasn't known as Fort William, it was called Fort Inverlochy. Now the Commonwealth's approach was really unique, and it differed from future governments' approach to how to handle the Highland clans. Now what they did, they came in trying obviously looking to pacify the clans after the end of the Civil War, but they didn't come in burning villages and attacking the clans. They came in, took a different approach. They didn't ban tartan and ban the Celt. They came in and they tried to keep the clan's pride intact, at the same time trying to pacify them and null them, and essentially get them to submit to the new regime, the Commonwealth. Now when the troops arrived here to start building this fort, they would have been shadowed by many Highlanders and clansmen up in the hills in the heather, overlooking what was happening here, and they would have known themselves what was to come in the following years, because this garrison was being constructed here, like I say, to nullify and pacify the clans. Now originally it was called Fort Inverlochy, but it was given a different name by the Highlanders. Now it was called An Garrison du Inverlochy, and that is Gaelic for the Black Garrison of Inverlochy. Now this fort construction here was not good news for the Highlanders and clansmen, because they knew themselves what this meant for the years to come. There'd be a lot more English patrols going through the Highlands, essentially looking to control them, because they had just been a nuisance for the Commonwealth during the middle of the 17th century. They were continually supporting the Stuart dynasty, the Stuart kings. So this was the reason why they were building this main fort here and others throughout the Highlands, to control and pacify these clans. Now it was built by 1,000 infantrymen under the control of Colonel William Bryan and at the time Major John Hill. So they had been fighting in Ireland before the end of the Civil War. So the majority of these troops and the command had come from Ireland, and had now been tasked with building this fort, building and manning this fort. Now, not too far from here is a place called Achnacarry. Now, that was the lands that were controlled by Clan Cameron, who the chief of Clan Cameron was Ewan Cameron of Locheil. Now, Ewan Cameron was the birth name given to most Clan Cameron chiefs, but they're also known as Locheil, so it can be a bit confusing, because Locheil was the area, but many of these chiefs, they were called whatever area they were from, so Ewan Cameron of Locheil, he was often referred to as Locheil, the same as the chief of Glengarry, and Keppoch. So the Achnacarry lands it's not too far from here. Now, I've got quite an interesting story to tell you about that. Now, the story of Ewan Cameron of Locheil goes apparently that an English patrol was going through Lochaber up towards Achnacarry, and they were set amongst them by Camerons that were led by Locheil, who was present at the time. And it said that he tore the throat from an English officer's neck, and he said it was the sweetest bite I had ever taken. So I'll leave it up to you if you believe that story or not, but I did do a bit of research and I saw there was a couple of different kind of sources that were kind of saying the similar thing. But it was just a little story to kind of describe how it was before relations got a bit better here, because in the years later, so by 1656, John Hill, he was now actually the governor of Inverlochy, and he was very clever. He was quite an important figure here because he had spent some time here. He was obviously there at the construction of the fort, and he really gotten to know the clans, and specifically the clan chiefs, and really gained an understanding of, you know, Highland traditions and clan honour, and he became very familiar with you know, clan pride. And he was very clever in doing this because he met up with Ewan Cameron of Locheil and other clan chiefs, and it's noted that they did go hunting and they did communicate with each other quite a lot. And it's during one of these conversations, it's believed that Colonel John Hill, being a very savvy diplomat, he spoke to Locheil about, you know, submitting to the Commonwealth, to the Cromwell regime, now that the war is over, but in a way, to do it in a way that wouldn't harm their pride, you know, because they're obviously, these clan chiefs, they're very proud, and you know, they were warriors, and it wouldn't take much for them to, you know, go headed straight into battle. But that's not what the Commonwealth wanted, or Colonel John Hill. They approached it, you know, in a very different way that later governments would do. So the story goes that Ewan Cameron of Locheil came into the fort of Inverlochy led by his piper and hundreds of his clansmen. So inside the fort, it was just like a parade ground, because this fort, it's not the stone structure you see today, it was a wooden fort. So they came in the parade ground and they dropped their weapons, each clansman, as they came in, and then they marched around the parade ground, being led by the piper of Ewan Cameron of Locheil. And then before they were leaving the fort, they picked up their weapons and then left the fort as peaceful citizens of the Commonwealth. So this was, you know, the submission that was essentially keeping intact their pride, but in the same time, this was them submitting. They'd essentially given this little ceremony to say, you know, okay, yeah, we're part of the Commonwealth, you won't get any trouble from us. So I just thought it was quite an interesting submission, because they didn't come and exactly bend the knee, but this was seen as good enough for Colonel John Hill and the Commonwealth. And after this time as well, it was a relatively peaceful time in the Highlands that had always been so notorious for fighting and battles. But this period, when Colonel John Hill was made governor in 1656, from that point onwards, he really learned the traditions of the Highlands, and in particular the clansmen. He got to know how they were and their pride, and this is how he managed to get them to come in and submit, because he knew they were pride, and they wouldn't come in, all these clan chiefs, they wouldn't come in, bend the knee, kissing the ring, pledging fealty. They wouldn't do that. There was no way that was going to happen, so you had to think of a different way for them to do it, and this was one of his ideas. I think it's quite a brilliant idea. But during this time also, the clans in the Highlands, they were relatively quiet. It was quite a peaceful period. There was not much fighting between, you know, the Commonwealth Army and the clans. It was really a period of stability, especially in the Highlands. You know, and I think a lot of that has got to go down to the credit of John Hill, because he really spent years here getting to know the clans, getting to know the clansmen, their way of life. You know, they hunted together. There's many accounts through Colonel John Hill's letters that he hunted with Ewan Cameron of Locheil and other clan chiefs on the soldiers here hunted with the Highlanders. It was really so different at that point compared to how it would become in years later through a different government, through William III, which we'll come on to quickly. But I just think it's really interesting how the way they approached the submission and the pacification of the clans was successful because they didn't get any trouble from them. There was no big battles, there was no big revolts, and it's because they were very attuned to their pride. I mean, that's one of the, if you believe in like the 7 deadly sins, all of the sins, they all stems from pride. Pride is the deadliest of the 7 sins. And Colonel John Hill, he knew this. He was very clever, a very clever diplomat. He knew how to pacify the clans whilst keeping their pride intact. Now it seems quite nice here right now because it's summer, but during the winter this is a really cold place because it is in the centre of the Highlands, and the winters here would have been harsh. So when soldiers were garrisoned in here at the time, when it was the fort Inverlochy, it could only garrison around 100 people inside the fort at the time. So the rest of the soldiers, they had to camp outside, in more like tent and thatch housed kind of accommodation. So it would have been absolutely freezing if you weren't able to stay inside the fort. And even if you were in the fort, it would have been absolutely freezing to stay in these wooden forts in the midst of winter. So in 1658, news had reached the fort that Oliver Cromwell had died. Now, during this news, Colonel John Hill, he immediately recognised Cromwell's son as the new legitimate protector of the realm, as he was called. But and immediately after that, he hosted a huge kind of ceremony here in celebration of that. And many of the clan chiefs came to Inverlochy fort to celebrate this the anointing of the Cromwell's son, the protector of the realm, the new protector of the realm. So they came and had a big feast here, and there was loads of drinking with the clansmen and the soldiers. They're all together. There was a lot of camaraderie. But in the underbelly, many people knew that this was really the end of the Commonwealth.
Now, within months, Hill was a governor of nothing, and the monarchy was restored with King Charles II. Now, on the parade ground in Inverlochy, Hill then handed over the keys of the fort to Ewan Cameron of Locheil, who accepted them on behalf of King Charles II. As Hill left, he saw the black garrison being ransacked and burned by cheerful Camerons celebrating the restoration. In 1690, during the reign of King William III, General Hugh Mackay of Scowrie was commander of King William's troops in Scotland. He rebuilt Monk's timber fort into a stone fort and now named it Fort William, after the king, as part of efforts to control the Highland Clans. Now, during this time after the construction of Fort William, this is now the second fort, the original one being Fort Inverlochy. Now this is a new fort, Fort William, built in 1690. Now during that time, Colonel John Hill had been recommissioned as a colonel in King William III's army and had been appointed as the governor of the newly built Fort William. Because you have to remember, from the period of him leaving when Fort Inverlochy was handed over to Cameron of Locheil, he had not been employed in the British or the Commonwealth Army. And now this was essentially his reinstatement into the army years, even decades later, from the 1650s now up to the 1690s. So at this point here, Colonel John Hill, he was an old man. He was in his 70s at this point.
Now, in 1692, Colonel John Hill, he received orders in Fort William from higher officers to carry out the gruesome deed of the Glencoe Massacre. Now, there's much evidence to support the fact that Colonel John Hill actually sat on these orders for at least a week or two before having to forcibly issue it to his delegates, his lower command, to carry out the deed. You have to understand that Colonel John Hill was he would have been very reluctant to carry out this task, because if you go back to when he was in charge of Fort Inverlochy in the 1650s, when he was the governor, he had approached it in a much different way to pacify these clans, and he was ultimately successful in doing that task because he received many years of peace throughout the Highlands amongst all the clans. But this government of William III was much different to the government back then, and also they were aware, the higher officers in Edinburgh and the Crown in England, they were aware of John Hill's sort of what they thought his leniency and his kindness towards the clans. So they were actually in direct communication with his subordinate officers. So if he didn't issue the orders, his subordinates would have done so without him, essentially making him look like a bit of a fool. Now, if we rewind the clock a couple of years back, before the Glencoe Massacre, Colonel John Hill faced many challenges as the governor of Fort William, mainly with his own soldiers in the fort, because for a while they were actually going unpaid and without a lot of food, and they didn't even have basic clothes or blankets, because there's records and evidence of Colonel John Hill writing to the Privy Council in Edinburgh, who were the lawmakers of Scotland at the time, begging them for basic things like clothes for his troops and blankets. And he's noted as saying in one of the letters that a poorly clothed soldier makes for a bad soldier. And he was right, because this led to many desertions during the fort, and the garrison kept getting smaller and smaller. And there's many more accounts of Colonel John Hill struggling to maintain this garrison and to maintain order at the Fort William. And then bearing in mind that he was very old at this time, when Fort William in the 1690s, he was in his 70s, he was an old man, and there's accounts of him being sick and near death on many occasions, also struggling himself with the lack of food that they were being provisioned for, because he had given the order, once they'd been struggling to get food supplies from Edinburgh and Glasgow, he had been writing constantly and receiving no word and no help from the government of Scotland for food and supplies. So he told his men to go out to the countryside and try to take some cattle and get food from there. But the clansmen were clever. The clansmen of Glencoe and Cameron, they took their cattle way up into the mountains, because they had already known what was probably going to happen, that their cattle would have got stolen. So they had overseen that before the decision was even made. So they took their cattle way up into the hills, so the redcoats couldn't get any of them. Now, many soldiers were rebelling at the time. I mean, if you were going to work and you weren't getting paid, I don't think you would have been too happy either. And bearing in mind, these soldiers, they couldn't just up and leave the fort. They had to stay there, because the penalty of desertion was death. So if you said, "Oh, I've had enough, I don't want to stay here," you would have been lined up against the wall and shot. But Colonel John Hill, he did it. He wasn't that heavy-handed. There's accounts of him throwing soldiers in jail cells when they were being rebellious like this, because he wasn't a heavy-handed governor. He probably would have been one of the better colonels and governors to serve under. Now, at this time, many soldiers perished at the garrison from sickness. There's letters that give accounts of at least a third of the garrison dying from sickness. And Colonel John Hill himself, it's noted in his letters that he said that the graveyard outside the fort was continuing to grow and grow, being filled with many young men, much to his despair.
Movie or something, eh?
No, just people walking.
What's that?
Just people walking.
Just filming people walking?
Yeah. It's part of a YouTube video. So.
All right. Okay.
Well folks, that's the end of the video. If you've watched a few of my other videos, you'll know that I like to end it out sometimes just talking about the location of the place that I've been to, or the subject matter. And just to wrap it up, I mean, if you've never been to Fort William before, it is an absolutely beautiful place, and it's shadowed by the biggest mountain in the UK, in Ben Nevis. Absolutely spectacular. And it is really interesting to see how Fort William has really transitioned over the centuries, from being, from the Fort Inverlochy in the 1650s, going through that period where it was destroyed and then rebuilt in Fort William at the end of the 17th century. And then as the tides of history came over it, things have changed, and now it's actually known as the outdoor capital of the UK. And you can see why, because it's got Ben Nevis at its doorstep. But it's really interesting, and it's a beautiful place as well. I mean, if you ever consider coming here, do it right away. It really is beautiful, and it's just a little town. It's not like a big city. It's a nice little town, and I've came here many times on holiday with my family, and it's a beautiful place, and I would highly recommend visiting here. So folks, if you did enjoy the video, please subscribe to the channel and also leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm, because those are the ones that really help the video grow, the interaction. Good or bad, I'm open to criticism, things that I've did wrong in the video or things you like. Either way, just leave a comment, it would be greatly appreciated. So folks, on that note, take care and I'll see you in the next video.